Hi, everyone. This is Talk Back. It's Tuesday, May 17th, 2022. And today I have another special show in my what I call my Turning Points uh, theme of shows. What is a turning point? Some uh, decisive moment when a path is changed, a destiny is renewed, relearned, changed to something different. Is it an irrevocable thing? How do these turning points come along and how do they affect our lives and the trajectory of the things that we do in life? We all have those moments. What are your turning points? And today I have the pleasure of speaking with a important member of our community, the Jewish community and the larger community in Eastern Connecticut, Rav Julius Rabinowitz, who is the rabbi of the Beth Jacob congregation in Norwich, Connecticut. Good afternoon, Rabbi. How are you?
Good afternoon, and I'm pretty thrilled about being here. It's a very new experience, very different experience, and I'm looking forward to this. So,
Okay, great. And it's great to talk with you. We're going to have a conversation where I think um, we all have a certain image of what a Rav, a rabbi should be. And you have your inner lives, the lives that you show to the world. And we're going to learn maybe a few things about your history and your thoughts and how you got to where you are today. So let me start with this, Rav. We were involved together with putting on the Yom HaShoah program in Eastern Connecticut that was sponsored by the uh, Federation of Eastern Connecticut as well as Hadassah. And you were part of that program when we did our annual candle lighting ceremony to honor and memorialize lives we've lost in the Holocaust and also to honor and memorialize survivors. And you were part of that program, and you asked specifically that you would be the one to intone the El Mole Rachami prayer that one says to memorialize those we've lost. And when you said it, Rabbi, I heard uh, a very slight crack in your voice and when you were intoning it. So tell me, you have a connection, don't you, to the Holocaust in your family history. Can you talk about that?
um, yeah. So, for most of my life, let's say until about 15 years ago, my connection with the Holocaust was mostly through my parents who were survivors. And I had a very strange way of learning about my parents' involvement, uh, their experiences with the Holocaust, and it was a very jarring experience, and it stayed with me for decades because of how I learned about my parents' experience in the Holocaust, and they both lived through it throughout the entirety of the war. But the particular experience that, or the I think what you heard was really a different experience that I gained about 10, 15 years ago. I had always known that both of my parents had been married before they married to each other, and both of them had lost a child. And so I always felt a connection through some child that my parents lost. But about 10 years ago, as on a particular Yom HaShoah, that morning they asked in my seminary if anybody wanted to lead services, and I said yes, I did, and which was kind of unusual that I did. And when they said, well, why did you jump immediately for it, I mentioned the fact that while my parents had lived through the Holocaust, that my half brother and my half sister were murdered in the Holocaust. And so there was a new connection that I developed again about 10, 15 years ago with the Holocaust that I didn't have my entire life. And it's, I don't know, I don't want to try to create a macho thing that has made me closer to the murders and the deaths, but in a way, it brings it home where it's now within my immediate family. Whereas before it was distant relatives that I didn't have any kind of connection with because they were 20 or 40 or 50 years older than I was. But here were two little children, ages 3 and 5, who were murdered. And so what you heard that afternoon was probably the cracking of my voice. thinking about the two of them and saying the El Malay, chanting the El Malay for their souls.
Wow.
Uh,
So did you say you only learned about these two half brother and half sister about when you were 15 years old or 15
no,
years
no,
ago?
about 15 years ago. Again, I've always known about them, and again, I've always known that they're related to me because we shared a father, or we shared a mother, but I didn't have a direct relationship to them until about 10, 15 years ago, when I realized that they were a brother, they were a sister. They weren't just the children of two different families. They were part of my family. So that's probably what you heard.
Well, do you want to tell us a little bit something about your parents?
So,
How they
so my parents. So, without getting into a lot of the details about how I learned about my parents and their experiences in the Holocaust, but we had a unwritten rule. And by the way, this is not that unique, what I'm about to share, but we had an unwritten rule which basically says they're not going to talk about it, and I'm not going to ask questions. And again, it was because of the way that I learned about it, because it was kind of a shocking way to learn about it, that this was a rule that we basically followed probably until about 5 or 10 years before their death. That again, I didn't ask questions, and I didn't ask questions because I respected the privacy that I felt they wanted to maintain. So it stayed that way until there was a popular program on NBC about 40 years ago, a series, like a 4 or 6 part series on the Holocaust. And this was the first time that they started speaking about it. But again, it was very halting in terms of what they were going to speak about. And again, I was not going to ask any question beyond anything that they wanted to talk about. And so to this day, I know very little about what their actual experiences were.
Were they interned in a concentration camp?
They survived because they spent most of the war in the Lodz ghetto. And so that because they were able to survive in the Lodz ghetto until the ghetto was liquidated in 1944, when they finally did get sent to concentration camps, and I don't want to minimize it, but when they finally did get sent to a concentration camp, it was towards the end of the war, so their chances of survival were greatly increased because of that. But again, it's not something that I could speak to with any degree of. I'm a historian by nature. I'll travel far and wide to find the facts of yesterday. And unfortunately, this was one fact that I had to respect and allow to be not to be uncovered out of respect to my parents. And so I'm at a loss, unfortunately, for much of the suffering that they went through.
Well, I don't think your experience is that much different from many other children of survivors that I've spoken to. For many of them, their parents didn't start talking until the 1970s, the 80s, 20, 30, 40 years after what they had gone through. And it's a psychological barrier in many families. Did you ever feel in your heart that you wish they were more open with you about it, or wanted to share with them the pains that they had, that you could perhaps comfort them as their living child?
So the selfish part of me says absolutely yes. The selfish part of me says I would want to know every detail that they possibly could share. But there's the other part of me that well, to be totally honest, I'm sure there was a part of me that didn't want to know, and that there was a part of me that was probably applauding the arrangement that we had, and that I was excused from wanting to know. But I wish we didn't have the arrangement. I wish we could have talked about it, and I just have to accept the reality that we didn't get it. we didn't get to talk about it.
Well, we know in the Jewish religion that we commemorate the yortzites, the deaths each year of people that we've lost. Was there such a yortzite memorialization for your two siblings, your half siblings, as you went through your life? Did you remember any of that? Did your parents do that?
Yeah. So my parents didn't share with me those dates, but I do use, I was able to find dates when there was a period of time when all of the 3-year-olds and all of the 5-year-olds were sent out of the ghetto to be murdered in a concentration camp. So I do have those dates that I can use for their yahrzeit and to remember them. So I do have a little bit, if you will. And again, I was able to piece this through, not through my parents, but through my own historical searches for when things happen in the ghetto.
So how do you imagine the pain, the anguish that both your mother and father went through, having the history they did and having a personal policy, as it were, to not speak of it, to not share it, because it was so hard, I guess, to do?
As a rabbi, and again, it's easier for me to answer your question today, maybe than 15 or 20 years ago. But as a rabbi, more so than as a lawyer in terms of my previous life, I've come to learn that we're not entitled to know everything. That, as you know, as a lawyer, we feel that we are entitled to ask every question, and that not only are entitled to, but that we're obligated to. And as a rabbi, I've come to learn that no, we don't have that entitlement, and that we do get to respect people's privacy, and that if people do assert that they have a difficulty of sharing something, that it's not up to us to say, well, we're entitled to know, or we have to know, or we need to know so that we can help you, that we respect the individual. And if the individual says, no, I'm sorry, you don't need to know, then we accept it. So when I first realized how much I didn't know, I felt very regretful. But now looking back and understanding and respecting my parents, more so than respecting the information that they could have shared, makes it very easy for me to accept what the arrangement was. And again,
Right.
I have to confess that part of it was probably something that I didn't want to know.
Yeah. Well, I as a rabbi, one of your prime responsibilities, jobs in the community, is to bring comfort, use some of the experiences you have to help people find some measure of comfort or catharsis from loss of loved ones. And so it seems to me you're using some of the information about how your parents and you interacted to help deal with others who've lost. I mean, I guess my question is, how has what happened to you and your family impacted how you help people when they come to you for comfort in times of grief?
So I don't want to say that I have some unique connection to suffering or some unique connection to pain, that somebody who might not be children of Holocaust survivors or even worse, that somehow I have some kind of monopoly on this, because whatever pain or whatever connection that I might have with suffering, I'm sure that any colleague of mine has either that kind of suffering or some other kind of pain that my colleague can also employ. So it's, I guess I'm a little bit leery about using, if you'll pardon the expression, using the Holocaust in any way that will benefit me or that will help me. And that one of the things that it's my personal peeve, if you will, is this, that I really don't like how much money has been made on the Holocaust, if you will, through various media, through various references. So on a personal level, I try not to I try not to rely or not to assert or not to employ or even reference any kind of connection that I might have to the Holocaust, only because to do so might cheapen it, might make it less holy than it really is to me. So I'm a little bit leery about relying upon my connection or my experiences in any way that would benefit me, or that would anyway, I don't know, make me a better person. Even if it does make me a better person, I hope I'm not sounding too neurotic about this. But again, it's something that's very special to me because of my parents and because of the relatives that were lost. And so it's very important for me not to ever misuse it.
I understand that you have a very personal and deep connection to it. That's not there for you to share with everyone, but there's a tension there, because I'm sure you want to, like most of our community, we want to keep the memory of those we lost alive, and we want the Holocaust to be understood and remembered throughout history. And you enjoy history, but you're able to separate the two ideas.
Actually, there was somebody who taught me about 10 years ago when I first came to the community. I won't embarrass her by mentioning her name, but if she's watching, she knows who I'm talking about, who taught me about how to speak about the Holocaust in a way that doesn't cheapen the experience, but makes it very personal, and again, doesn't misuse it. So I shouldn't say that it's impossible to talk about it. It's just that I'm very sensitive about talking about it, is really that's what I'm saying.
Now, did you have any siblings growing up with your parents?
Yes, I had an older brother, and just to fill in a few of the holes, my older brother, who was all of about 4 or 5 years older than me, was my initial source about my parents and the Holocaust. And when he told it to me, he was probably no more than 12 or 13 years old. So just to give you, and I was 8 or 9 at the time. So I just wanted to give you a sense of how I learned about it. And I always felt like he had a closer connection to the Holocaust because he was older than me. But it's kind of hard to explain it that way.
Right. So the two of you communicated you talked about it. And
well, we did, but again, we did in the context of always assuring each other that we would respect the arrangement, and that we wouldn't do anything to upset our parents just because we might have had a selfish need to know.
Yeah, just one last question about your folks. Did they meet after after the Holocaust or before?
Yeah. Okay, so there's a great story here. They both lived in Lodz, and for those in your audience who don't know Lodz is a city in Poland, the second largest city in Poland, and it probably in World War II probably had probably 300,000 or 400,000 people, and probably about 100,000 or so Jews. So my parents didn't know each other. They were married to two different people, and they each had a child. And they each lost their children, and they each lost their spouse. And then after the war, my parents were in a displaced persons camp. And one of my aunts ran into the woman who was going to be my mother, and they sort of knew each other. And my aunt served as a matchmaker for my parents to come and meet, and got married and had kids. I do want to say one thing about my parents, because there's something very positive about, when I say positive, meaning there's something that they were able to extract from their Holocaust experience, which is perhaps the one gift that I know that they gave me, which is a sense of loyalty to each other. I don't know that my parents still were able to feel love at that time in their lives, but they had a sense of loyalty to each other that I've always maybe understood as being the equivalent of what people might say as love. And it was a very beautiful thing to watch the two of them being extremely loyal to each other, to the point where it was the kind of thing that as a kid, I'm sure when you were a child, that you would have like buddies that you would rely upon and you'd be loyal to, and that's what my parents really ingrained in me. And I really believe that they got it from, again, the negative experience, but they got it from this Holocaust life that they lived through.
Well, Rev, there are so many wonderful and interesting stories about meetings in the DP camps after the war. Many marriages, births. Our own friend Ramona Primus was born in a DP camp. So your parents, of course, everyone, they're unique. They're your parents, but their story resonates with so many others who went through similar experiences after the war. So we're talking to you as a rabbi, but that's not the profession that you first started out with. So, and you said you were interested in history. Did you study history in school? And then what path did you take in your professional life after college?
So the one thing that I could say about my life is that the big decisions that I made along the way weren't really made the way most people make decisions. So, for instance, if you were to, and I'm sure if I were to ask you about how you were attracted to the law, you would probably give us some examples of perhaps some situation where you were wronged or you saw somebody was wronged and you felt like that this was something important to do in life, and that there be that's more than just a wage earning occupation, that there is something that attracts the individual to the law. I didn't have that. What attracted me to the law was participating in a pageant in 8th grade in which, and I didn't want to participate, which perhaps explains also what I'm about to share with you. And I was the prosecuting attorney in a skit in which Abe Lincoln is going to be a defense attorney. And if you know anything about pageants, and if it's an Abe Lincoln pageant, then you know that I, as the prosecutor, that the script is going to put me as the loser of this case. And by the way, I do lose the case to Abe Lincoln. And when I'm sitting, having, I want to say a beer, but I was in 8th grade. So when I was having I guess a Coca-Cola or something, and I was thinking about the experience, I said, well, you know what? I'm a very competitive person, a very sports athletic competitive person. And I cannot think of retiring with an 0-1 record as a lawyer. So again, and I'm not making this up, but in the 8th grade, I vowed I was going to become a lawyer because I was not going to, again, end my legal career with an 0-1 record. Now, fast forward about 12 years, maybe 10 years, and I have just finished my first case, and I've won my first case. It was a very small case, but I've won my first case, and I'm sitting there with the judge's decision in my hand, reading this. And by now, I've graduated to a glass of wine, and I'm reading this decision, and I'm thinking to myself, well, okay, I've now evened the record. Do I need to do this anymore? And I was seriously thinking about, again, at the age of 25 or 26, saying, okay, I finished this part. Let's now move on. Anyway, that this judge's decision was written so nicely that I said, you know what, this is too much fun and I'm enjoying this. So let's just keep going. And we kept on going for another 30, 35 years or so.
Wow. So when they chose you to be in this pageant and to play the role of the prosecuting attorney, they knew that you had some skills. So you were chosen for that role.
No. Wait. No. I'm sorry.
No.
Again, I didn't want to participate, and so I kept my hand down when they were giving out the parts. And finally, when the last part was about to be given out, the teacher said, okay, who doesn't have a part yet? And of course, I was not raising my hand, but Randy Kruger, who sat next to me,
raised your hand.
Mrs., I forgot her name, Mrs. Julius doesn't have a part. Okay, so that's how I got. So again, nobody thought I was a lawyer in waiting. They just
Were
said,
were you
yeah.
just shy? Were you a shy kid, or you just didn't want to participate?
I didn't, I never liked participating in shows. I never liked participating as an actor. I'll never forget. All of my friends were doing the drama in high school, Camelot. They all sang. There was King Arthur. One was Lancelot. Somebody was Guinevere. And fast forward about 40 years, I'm fishing at a funeral where I'm chanting the El Malay, and one of my friends from high school comes up to me and says, Julius, you have such a great voice. Why didn't you ever sing, when we're doing Camelot? Why didn't you participate? And I said, you think I want to stay after school and like hang out with you guys for hours waiting for this 2 minute, So anyway, no,
Well,
no, I'm not an actor.
Yeah, you do have a very nice voice. You do. And because we heard it when you chanted the El Mole. And I'm thinking, my goodness, in 8th grade, that bruise to your ego, your 8th grade ego, that I have to get even with Abraham Lincoln. It wasn't good enough just to be on the stage with Abraham Lincoln and be it part of his glory. You had to compete with him and win. Yeah. But you are wrong about being a lawyer. I know you were a lawyer. You have to be an actor as a lawyer to go in the courtroom. If you do any jury trials, or even to make your arguments in front of the judge, you have to have a good sense of presence, and you need to be a good actor. Don't you agree?
Well, okay. So my first position was in a very, very large law firm in New York City. It was a litigation department meeting, and the chief litigator for the firm said the following: if any of you ever are in trial and are appearing in front of a jury, you should be considering the fact that you're committing malpractice. Okay? So what he's really telling me is I should never trust my case to a jury. I should never trust my case to somebody other than somebody, either myself or maybe one other person, meaning a judge. But again, I was trained never to see a jury, because again, you don't want to trust this very, very highfalutin case, with all of these very complex issues. You couldn't trust a jury. Now, I'm going to tell you, judges were no smarter than juries.
Exactly, I would say the same thing.
But at least you knew that the judge went to the same type of training that you did. So at least I could talk to the judge, because he or she went through similar training. The person on the jury could be a doctor, they could be in retail, they could be in 1,000 different things, but I don't know how to talk to that person.
Well, you learn that. You get consultants, you learn it, you learn this, and you're right. Some people are great actors and great lawyers, and other lawyers do fantastic writing in the libraries on the 101st floor of their 2,000 man, women law firms. So it all depends, but that is interesting. So you use the expression when you wrote to me before we did this interview, accident of life. And as a rabbi, I've asked this. I asked this of Rabbi Ekstrand, who I interviewed, Rabbi Berg, I believe. What is an accident of life? We use, as Jews, we often use the expression, it's bashert, it's destiny, it's going to happen to you. Do you believe in bashert? Do we have free will? Was that 8th grade experience that transformed you, made you into a lawyer? Did that happen by choice, or was that God's hand working on you and working on your destiny? I don't know. I can't answer that question. Can you?
So one of the things that, at least that I'm sensitive to, but when I talk to other rabbis, they're sensitive to. I don't want to give off the impression that I've got a pipeline to God, or that God talks to me. So that I'm not going to say that if an accident of life occurs, that there's God who's pulling strings and somehow managing to get me to move in a certain direction. But the fact of the matter is, that seems the way that things work in my life. That For instance, I never announced I want to be a rabbi. In fact, there's a story about 40 years ago in which I was actually admitted to rabbinical school, admitted to a Chabad Lubavitch rabbinical school. But it didn't happen because I was not supposed to be going to rabbinical school at that time. But if I think back 40 years later or 35 years later, I didn't want to be a rabbi, but what I discovered was that the best Jewish education was in rabbinical school. So that, for instance, as a kid, I went to yeshiva. So I had a lot of Hebrew and Jewish training, education that boys and girls that didn't go to yeshiva wouldn't get. So later on in life, and about 15 years ago or so, I was very much interested in Jewish education and realized that the Jewish education that you could find in the synagogue, synagogue classes, and by the way, they're great, but that they weren't good enough for what I needed. So I hunted around and I discovered again that in a seminary, they had the best Jewish education. I didn't know you had to want to become a rabbi. I thought you just had to pay whatever the fees were and you got to study there. So when I applied to this particular seminary, they said, "Do you want to be a rabbi?" I said, "No, I don't want to be a rabbi. I just want to study Judaism." And I said, "Well, you don't understand. This is not a secondary school. This is not a college. This is not a place for learning. This is a place to be a rabbi, to become a clergy person." So I said, "What does it take to become a clergy person?" He said, "Well, you have to fill out an application." So I said, "Give me the application. I'll fill it out. And if you guys think that I've satisfied the application, then let me go to school here." So they liked the application. I passed that part. And so I went there and I was going there for about 2-3 years. Again, having no desire to become a rabbi. I just was there as we say, to study Torah Lishma, just to study Torah for the purpose of studying Torah, for no other purpose. And then I had what we call an accident of life, in which I'd like to think that maybe God did have something to do with it, or maybe it was just a coincidence. But this fabulous legal career that I had all of a sudden just dried up. I don't want to say overnight, but it dried up. And so I didn't have a legal career to fall back on, or maybe God was telling me, "Julius, it's time to stop doing all this legal stuff. You finished it. It's time for you to do rabbi stuff." And so I listened to whatever was being told to me. And so I moved into becoming a rabbi. But again, it wasn't that, I would love to be able to romanticize the decision and saying that I was thinking about wanting to be a rabbi my whole life, and that this was a dream. I'm sure that if my parents were alive, they would probably be scratching their head and saying, "Where did this come from?" Because even though they sent me to yeshiva, and again, if they hadn't, I don't think I could have done what I would have been able to do. But they were the ones that put it all into motion by sending me to yeshiva. So I'd like to say that maybe they knew a lot more about me and my future than even I did.
Well, that's interesting. So the turning point started when your parents sent you to yeshiva. Let's back up a little bit and get some historical context
Sure.
here. What state did you grow up in?
Okay, so I was born in the Bronx, but I'm a New Jersey boy.
Okay.
And
what
grew up
town?
in Patterson. And Patterson at the time, I'd like to say, was a very diverse melting pot of Jews, Italians, African Americans, Puerto Ricans. In fact, I don't think we had any WASPs. Maybe we had a few, but it seemed like we had everything else but that in Patterson.
Now, did your brother go to yeshiva too? Did you both go?
He did a few years, but he was not cut out for yeshiva.
Okay.
There was something that in fact, maybe this is a better way to put it. I ran into a very, very famous scholar about 5-10 years ago, and he learned that I went to yeshiva, and he asked me what my experience was, what my memory was, and I said, "I have the fondest memories of my years in the yeshiva, with perhaps one exception. but I loved it. I was actually enthralled. I loved going every morning, coming home every night, and then working and studying. And then he says, "But wait a minute, you're not Orthodox. What happened?" And he says, I didn't want to become Orthodox." And so he said to me, "You're the first person that he's ever met that has a positive experience from the yeshiva, but didn't become Orthodox."
Interesting. So as I was going to ask, where did you live in an Orthodox home, and did
Yeah.
you feel?
Excuse me one second. I'm sorry. I just want to tell you, I just got interrupted by one of my colleagues who you
Okay.
interviewed. So
Really?
if you said something just now, I missed it because he
He
interrupted.
probably is sending you
And
a
now I've
message.
lost the
but
voice.
You'll get the message later. We'll look forward to hearing what he had to say. So I guess my question was, you grew up in an Orthodox home. You followed kashrut. Did you feel?
I've lost your voice, Sheila.
Watch your phone. Shut your phone down, perhaps.
I'm not hearing anything.
I can hear you. Shut your phone down, Rabbi. Turn off your phone. Turn off your phone. We can hear you. Rabbi, we can hear you. We're going to get the rabbi back. I don't know what happened. I heard him, and everyone heard him. And I can hear you now. I can hear you, Rabbi.
Hello?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Well, I will keep. I wanted to ask the rabbi. We'll get back to him and ask him. I wanted to ask him about his experience growing up in an Orthodox home, going to yeshiva. What connections? Can you hear me now, Rabbi?
I can hear you now.
All right. Hopefully, our excellent producer Ellen Poitras, when we transfer this interview to YouTube, perhaps we can splice out some of the sound technical difficulties we had. So what I was going to
actually, Beth Jacob will be very proud to know that I think I did fix it, and that there's a reason why they've named me the Chief Technology Officer for the synagogue.
Okay. All right. Well, you're not alone in having these issues. So the question that I was asking is, having grown up in an Orthodox home, going to yeshiva, which is a full day school program where you study Hebrew and English, Torah, and so forth. What was your connection in your heart to Judaism, to following it? And, did you conceive of it as something that was really meaningful and deep for you when you were a kid?
So I could tell you that as a kid, I didn't appreciate the influence and the connection that it was making to me. So that, for instance, when I was 14 and my parents gave me the choice of continuing to the yeshiva or going to the public school, I said, public school, hands down. I'm out of yeshiva. I got to get back. I want to be with normal people. I remember that's what I told my parents. And then I actually not only went to public school, but I went into my own desert, my own midbar, that I went into my own wilderness for about 20 years, in which I tried to go as far as I could from Judaism, always keeping one leg in the faith, but nevertheless thinking that I belong somewhere outside. And the story that I love to tell is the woman who now is my wife, but at the time we were living together, and she lived across the street from Hebrew Union College in Manhattan on 4th Street. And one Shabbat morning, we wake up and she says, let's go to the synagogue across the street. And I said to her, and I haven't been in a synagogue with the exception of perhaps going with my father on holidays, but I hadn't been in a synagogue for about 20 years. And I remember telling her, I said, I'll tell you what, why don't you go and tell me if they've changed the ending? Because when I went, the service always ended the same way as the previous week. And I thought, why am I doing this? Because again, it's always the same. And so she said, no, you're coming. So anyway, I went, and I didn't realize something. And this goes back to a question that I think that I thought you were going to ask me, which was why my parents sent me to yeshiva, because we were not Orthodox. And I asked my father that question one time when I was around 11 or 12. And I said, why did you send me to yeshiva? We're not Orthodox. Why? And he said to me the following: so that you would feel comfortable, or said I would feel comfortable praying in any synagogue in the world. Now, I'm sure that my father was probably thinking that I'll be comfortable praying in any Orthodox synagogue in the world. But what I didn't realize, or what he didn't realize, was that it really made me feel comfortable to being in any synagogue of virtually any Jewish denomination, and maybe even being in any house of faith. That by having the security, and not the safety, but having the feeling secure within my Judaism, which is what those 10 years of yeshiva gave me, I didn't appreciate this bedrock of Judaism that was built inside of me. So that, again, 20 years later, when my wife said, let's go to a synagogue, it was very easy for me to say, sure, I'll feel comfortable there, just like I'll feel comfortable in any synagogue. And so that 15 years later, when I was thinking about going to seminary, again, I felt very comfortable being in that milieu. And then fast forward, when it came time for me to be a rabbi of a synagogue, I felt I could be a rabbi of any denomination that I felt a proximity towards, because again, I had that bedrock of Judaism that my parents prophetically saw that was going to be important for the rest of my life.
Okay, so we have to clear the air and straighten it out, because I asked the question thinking that you did grow up in an Orthodox home, but it wasn't.
Well, wait. It was close to Orthodox. I don't want to make okay. In other words, and by the way, just to tell you, when my father was able to not have to be compelled to work on Shabbat, because coming over after the Holocaust, after the war, my father didn't have choices in terms of where he was going to work, and so to put a meal on the table meant that he would have to work on Shabbat, for instance. But when he finally reached the age where there was no college or law school educations to pay for, or mortgages to pay for, then he went back to the orthodoxy of his youth. So we were sort of an Orthodox home, if you will.
Okay. All right. So let's get the timeline.
Sure.
How many you left yeshiva to go to regular school? Then you went to law school, because your 8th grade dream continued. I mean,
right.
How many other kids in 8th grade have this revelation, and it lasts for many, many years, and they go and they follow it. It doesn't leave them. Yours stayed with you. And how many years did you practice as an attorney before you made that application to the seminary?
So I practiced law in total about 40 years, and I continued practicing while I was in seminary, and I continued practicing for about a year or two after my position at Beth Jacob. And I thought I could continue doing a simultaneous life of practicing law and being a rabbi until one particular Friday that if you don't mind, I'll share with you what happened that day. In the morning, I got a phone call from a client. I practiced intellectual property my entire career. And this was a client that I had given copyright advice in the past. And he says to me the following, he says, Julius, I know you're going to tell me that I'm infringing somebody's copyright. I know that, but I need your counsel. I need your advice. I need your assistance on how we were going to minimize the detection of his infringement. In other words, how he was going to most likely get away with being able to do what he's doing. And so I gave him counsel. I didn't give him counsel to break the law, but I told him that if he does X, he'll be more likely to be caught than doing Y. Then that afternoon, I got a phone call from a congregant who basically says, Rabbi, I did something that was not so good, and I need some help in how to deal with the problem. And fortunately, he was not trying to skirt the problem, but I realized that I have two different types of people that I'm dealing with, and my head is spinning, going, like it's a spinning top in terms of figuring out where my head is supposed to be directed. So by the afternoon, I realized that I could no longer be a lawyer and a rabbi because there are just too many conflicts within myself, within my heart, within my mind, that I felt like my body was on tilt. That that I froze, if you will. So at that point, I said, you know what, my days of being a lawyer are now over.
Okay, so let me ask again to kind of figure this out, pin it down.
Sure.
You decided at some point in your legal career that you wanted more intellectual information about your heritage, about Judaism. You wanted to learn more Torah. You liked the experience of learning, and you thought that you could go to a seminary without having to really become a rabbi. But you had to apply to become a rabbi anyway to get in. So tell me, when was the turning point where you were getting this education and enjoying it, and you said, oh, I am going to become a rabbi when I finish this project?
Okay. So I knew, I knew I was going to, I knew there was going to be a point in time when I would finish the 70 or 75 courses that were required to become a rabbi. Although I wasn't sure, because I could have just continued doing this without finishing up all of the prerequisites. But I did think that there would come a time where I had fulfilled all the requirements, and that I was going to participate in a ceremony, and somebody was going to hand me a sheepskin. And by the way, it's probably somewhere in my office. I don't know where it is right now. But somebody was going to hand me a sheepskin, and it was going to say something very nice, that I am now a rabbi. But I never thought that I was going to do anything with it. I really thought that I was having a very interesting part of my legal career, actually. In fact, I would say that it was the most fulfilling part of my legal career. I was working for a Fortune 50 company, doing the most exciting work and dealing with lawyers all over the world, and saying, why would I ever want to think of giving up all of this excitement to be a rabbi? What for? And then, God stepped in, and this fabulous position that I had overnight dried up. And so it was like God saying, well, Julius, you know what? You don't really have this alternative of lawyer anymore. So it's about time that you just focus on the fact, just finishing up whatever you need here. And I want you to be a practicing rabbi, not just a thinking rabbi, but somebody who is actually going to be going out there out into the woods, out into the fields, and doing your shtick out there, and stop, hanging out in your office, and stop hanging out in the classroom, and do something. So that's what happened.
Okay. So,
but again, I'm going to be honest with you. If that legal career did not dry up, I couldn't imagine walking away from it. To tell you that it was exciting, to tell you that I was having people talk to me that wouldn't ever talk to me, because again, who I represented. And so,
right. So let me ask you,
sure.
You sound very excited and animated about the excellent experience you had as an intellectual property attorney. It's an interesting field. Do you have that same excitement and happiness in your voice, in your tone, when you talk about being a rabbi? Has that given you the same kind of In Yiddish, Fargenigen, a delightful experience that you felt when you were with those people in the intellectual property field?
I'm going to give you the following example. When I was a second-year lawyer, I remember sitting in one of the great big law firms of our time, and there was a lawyer of the same age sitting in the chair next to me. We were talking to a senior partner, and the lawyer next to me, actually, he was 1 year my junior. He says the following: "Joe, I was thinking about this problem this morning, about this case, while I was taking a shower." The words "while I was taking a shower" really, stuck in my mind, that here is this individual who thinks about the law so much that it means so much to him that he's thinking about his law cases while he's taking a shower. Okay, to me, when I'm taking a shower, I was thinking that it's more of my personal time, not when I'm thinking about professional time. Anyway, in my 40 years or so of practicing law, I don't think I ever reached the point where I thought about one of my cases in the shower, or I thought about my work in the shower. As a rabbi, I can't think of a place where I could be where I don't think about what I do as a rabbi. I can't think of a place where I could be where I could be surprised by thinking about Jewish stuff, Torah stuff, God stuff, the stuff that's, that I look upon my shelves here in the sanctuary that I have here in my office. I couldn't imagine what life is like outside of Judaism. And fortunately, I'm in this position where I'm told that I'm allowed to spend 24/7 in this Jewish world, and that it's not unhealthy for me to be so. So again, I can't think of doing anything else in my life than this. And
okay, so yes, yeah. So you explained it really well, that it is a 24/7 and all-encompassing thing, that when you belong to the community, and the community has you available all the time, because that's the role. So let's explain the term Rav. We think of a rabbi, I know, is unlike in the Christian religion, maybe I'm right or wrong about this, the priest is supposed to have the pipeline to God. You can't get to God without going through the priest in Catholicism. But in Judaism, the rabbi is supposed to be your teacher, your leader, right? Your relationship with God is your own personal. Is that right? Is that the role of the rabbi?
Yeah. So one of the things that a secret that us rabbis are not supposed to share is that, unlike virtually all other faiths, in Judaism, there is nothing that a rabbi can do that you can't do. There's actually probably one thing that a rabbi can do that you, Sheila, as a non-rabbi, cannot do. But beyond that, there is nothing that you need a rabbi for that you can't do on your own. Again, assuming that you have sufficient education and knowledge. So there's something very beautiful about Judaism that allows me to say to anybody that I talk to, and I say this and with a great deal of honesty, I tell them there's nothing that prevents you from becoming me. I mean, granted, I have a number of years of yeshiva training that you might not have, but again, there's nothing that prevents you from doing everything that I can do. And I love that about Judaism, and that it doesn't create a special class of people that are more holy than others, or that somehow get something that others don't get.
So tell us why the term Rav is what you prefer, R-A-V, versus Rebbe or Rabbi.
Yeah. Well, actually, this one's a pretty easy one. When you're, I use the word blessed, with a name like Julius Rabinowitz, if you're going to add more vowels or more syllables to that name, you want to minimize them. So rabbi now adds 2 more syllables onto what I just gave you, about 8 syllables. So if I can find a way to cut those 2 down to 1, I'm going to grab it. But there's something else going on here. Okay. And I'm picking the word Rav. I'm also trying to make it easy for you to be able to talk to me, but to use a word other than my first name alone, meaning that I know clergy people who like to have personal relationships with congregants and with parishioners and with people. And so they feel that by going on a first name basis, you create this personal bridge, if you will, to another person. And so for me, I always felt that as much as I want to be your friend, that there should be a distinction between me and the rest of your friends. And so therefore, it can't just be Julius. It has to be something Julius. Now, I could say Rabbi Julius, but it doesn't flow off the tongue the way Rav Julius does.
Okay.
The way, again, that one syllable word. And again, you might say, well, wait a minute, you're emphasizing something that doesn't deal with the substance, and yet it's everything to do with the substance because it's how we're creating this relationship. In other words, that the first step in the relationship is what our names are for each other. How do we refer to each other? So this isn't just a throwaway comment I'm making. This is a very important part of the beginning of every relationship that I have with every individual that I come to meet. And so it's important for me to emphasize certain things. Number one, there is a difference between me and all of your friends, but at the same token, I don't want that difference to be any greater than one syllable Rav. That's the only thing I want to make in terms of distinguishing me and all of the other good friends that you have in your life.
Right. So certainly as a Rav Julius, you're very accessible to your congregation. And even though there is an imbalance that you are the leader in a sense that they do look up to, and I would want to look up to, it's still more comfortable than I remember growing up in an Orthodox synagogue. The rabbi had a long beard and spoke with a Yiddish accent, and it was so overwhelming. And he was on such a pedestal. You couldn't really relate to it. You know, it was harder to relate to. And so now, Rav Julius, we can relate to. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up, I thought in order to be a rabbi, you had to have a long white beard and talk with a Yiddish accent. Otherwise, you couldn't be a rabbi.
So I want to tell you that 50 years ago, I told you about how I was I was sort of admitted to a Chabad Lubavitch seminary. It had to do with Vietnam. It had to do with getting exemptions. But the rabbi that was, quote unquote, interviewing me and perhaps going to allow me to attend this rabbinical said to me the following. I had hair down to my waist. And he said, and he knew me, by the way, from when I was a kid in yeshiva. And he said, the hair, I'm not so crazy about the hair, Julius, or excuse me, Yehuda. I'm not so crazy about the hair, but the beard, again, I had a beard like this. He said, the beard, I love the beard. The beard makes you look like a rabbi, you know?
Right.
And he said, but you got to cut the hair. You got to cut the hair. He says, rabbis with long hair doesn't match the long beard. So again, I had it, but I don't think I could ever spend the years it would take to regrow it.
Okay. So just a couple more questions before we conclude. What is the most important role that you perform as a rabbi? What is the indispensable thing that you do that your congregation needs?
So when somebody asks me for a job description, I essentially tell them that my synagogue pays me to study Torah, which is kind of maybe a selfish way of explaining it. But really what my community wants me to do is to be able to relate to them 24/7 or as close as possible, employing everything that I know about Torah. Now, that could be a very overwhelming chore if I want to make it very complex. But I've come to realize that you can make it very, very simple. And in fact, the simpler you make it, the easier it is for everybody. So I'm going to boil down everything that I do in the context of one verse in the Bible. And it's a verse that everybody or every Jew knows, and probably many non-Jews probably also know. For those knowing the Hebrew, it goes Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, Meloch Kol Haaretz Kavodo. And it translates into Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. And this is where people start falling off, because up until this point, everybody's thinking of holy, holy, holy being like an angel. But it's the next words that are so critical in terms of what I believe in and what I am as a rabbi. The words continue as the world is filled with God's glory. Now, I know there's a lot of different ways that you can understand this. But in the context of the Jewish way of thinking, of understanding God as one, if I've understood God as one, and I've said that the world is filled with God's glory, again, as a rational lawyer, Sheila, wouldn't you then say that the next point of the logic is, well, if God is one and the world is filled with God's glory, therefore the entire world must be God. Now, I've just said something very radical, and I am not about to spend the next 5 hours trying to explain how this entire world can be God, and somehow, Sheila, you and me having a conversation, and we still have this one God. But to tell you that God is everywhere makes my life so easy, because if I can see God everywhere, then I've elevated this world in a way that I can't possibly do by trying to focus on 1,000 different little things. So again, by my saying God is everywhere, in effect, I'm saying, Sheila, how can I disrespect you because I'm seeing God inside of you? So again, as a rabbi, I can see God everywhere, and it's hard for me to see anything where I can't see God.
So you've been in Norwich for about, was it 10 years or so now?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And have you changed? Have your ideas and feelings about being a rabbi and the things you do with the congregation, have they changed? And how did you make the transition from the New York City metropolitan area, which is so different from here in Eastern Connecticut? It's a different world in many ways.
So let's deal with the second half. Certainly, Eastern Connecticut is different than metropolitan New York City when it comes to Judaism. When I first would come to Eastern Connecticut, I used to posit that New York City metropolitan area was where the professional Judaism was, and Eastern Connecticut is where the provincial Judaism was. But then I came to realize that Judaism is actually perhaps better in the provincial than in the professional. That there's something more beautiful about hearing voices that may not be perfect like a choir, but at the same time, you're hearing real voices and not professional voices. You're hearing real voices, not paid voices. You're hearing real people, not trained people. And so I think that the best way that I could say this, and I say this not because you raised Yom HaShoah at the outset of our conversation, but because it's very meaningful. And again, it's very meaningful to me. Yom HaShoah, remembering the Holocaust, is something that in the New York City metropolitan area does not get a great deal of airplay, and certainly doesn't get as much exposure as many other parts of Judaism are revealed in this, in the New York City area. In sharp contrast, year in and year out, and it's not a morbid thing, but there is something about the way that Eastern Connecticut Jewry remembers, respects the Holocaust in a way that reveals that there is an intensity, that there is a meaning to Judaism in Eastern Connecticut that you can't find in New York. I would say, or at least I can't find in New York. And that's a Hamisha feeling that we're not putting on airs in terms of our Judaism. We're not going to show you how super we are in terms of our Jewishness, but we are going to show you how meaningful our Jewishness is to us. And maybe we don't wear it on our sleeve the way those New Yorkers do, but again, they live in a world that maybe allows them to wear it on their sleeve that Eastern Connecticut doesn't. But again, there is something very meaningful about the way that Judaism is lived here that, again, I just can't find when I'm in New York. And part it's because maybe there is just too much of it going on as compared to the way that we practice it in Eastern Connecticut. And and the other thing I was going to say, because this is also part of your question in terms of how I've moved over the last 10 years. I would say that in the first few years of being a rabbi, I was a very rational, logical person, and that it was very important for me to go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 in terms of whatever I was doing, whether I was teaching, whether I was praying. In other words, it was just very important for me to go on a very orderly fashion. And what I've come to realize is that perhaps sometimes we get too much order, and that what we really need is to shake ourselves up sometimes, and that we really need to shake things around and twist them around, and maybe to understand that the way we've tried to solve problems in the past, that maybe we need to solve them in a different way, maybe in a radically different way, but that there's so few years left in our lives for us not to be trying out every different possible way in terms of getting our lives to moving in the direction and in the purpose that we were all put here for. And so that I'm not thinking so much rationally anymore, but perhaps I'm thinking romantically, perhaps I'm thinking dreamily, but that's what I think that we're allowed to do in terms of our faith, that we don't have to be consigned to just what might be logically and rationally correct, because we're talking about something that I think goes far beyond the logic and the rational that as lawyers, you and me were trained to deal with, but that we're in a different sphere of our lives now. And so that's where I've moved in the last few years in terms of my being a rabbi here in Beth Jacob. And I'm just hoping that I can continue to communicate with all the people that I interact with, and that I don't lose the ability to share ideas with people and to speak their language, even if I'm coming up with new ideas.
Right.
Anyway, I hope that's a good wrap-up answer to what your question, I think, is designed to elicit.
It is a good wrap-up, and we're getting toward a conclusion. So as part of our conclusion...
Lost you again. I can't hear now.
So as part of our conclusion, I'm going to ask the rabbi when he comes back, which he will. I'm going to ask him what new ideas is he getting ready to spring forth for his community, for his congregation in the coming year, in the coming months. This has been an interesting talk. The rabbi has been very refreshingly honest and interesting. I love his turning points, his 8th grade pageant as a prosecuting attorney, losing the case and determining he's going to law school, and his other interesting travels through his Judaism, not being as involved at some point, getting back into it and going to be more educated in Torah and so on. Rabbi Rabinowitz has been Rav Julius has been a wonderful guest. I don't know if you can hear me now. Can you hear us now? You can hear me. So did you hear that last question? I wanted to end as a conclusion. I said, given your last answer about shaking things up and getting new ideas, do you have any future plans? What new ideas, new things are you putting into the mix for this coming year?
So without frightening too many of my congregants, what I would say is that over the last 2 years of the pandemic, that I've developed a new style of prayer, that when I pray, and again in the privacy of my home, but when I pray I take my watch off, I put it in a different part of the room, and I'm totally, I totally distance myself from what the time of the day is. And so what I'm going to try to impress upon my congregants, especially given the fact that many of them, maybe most of them, are in this retirement mode, that we should start taking our watches off more frequently and to do the things that are important for us without being confined and consigned to looking at the watch and to seeing what time it is and to seeing what we need to do next, but instead to stay on where we are in the present and to savor that moment rather than to think about what that next moment is. And so to me, that's a very radical thing to do. And I'm going to try to impress upon my congregants about the need to put that watch to the side in terms of how we live our lives.
Okay, great. I've been to various meetings, Rabbi, over the past several years, where when you walk into the room, you have to put your cell phone in a box and you don't get it back until the event is over. You could start that with the watches at the synagogue services. But all right, it's been great chatting with you. I always leave 2 more seconds for my guests to have any final words. Is there anything else that you would most like to say that you haven't had a chance to express?
I would say that I can honestly say that whenever anybody asks me how I am, that until a few years ago, I would start thinking about, well, this is wrong, or that's not doing so well, or this is. And what I have found over the last 4 or 5 years, and I don't know how much further back I can go, but that I have found that I answer that question each time by saying, things are going great. And to be able to respond to that question, how are you? And to be able to say each and every time, great, I am fabulous, I am fantastic, I am, in other words, to be able to say that each time tells me that at least in the present, and that's all I can tell you, because I can't tell you what's going to happen 5 minutes from now, but that in the present, I'm in a place where I'm supposed to be.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Rav Julius, for sharing this time with us. It was interesting and enlightening for those of us who know you. And we'll see everyone next time for our next program on Talk Back. Bye. Bye, Rav.
Goodbye.